Hi, this is Dr. Miller. In an earlier tutorial, you learned that an argument must meet two conditions in order to be considered a good argument. One is the logic condition, which means that the conclusion must actually follow from the premises, as the arguer implies that it does. The other is the truth condition, which means that all the argument's premises must in fact be true. You'll learn more about the logic condition next week. Today I want to discuss the truth condition in a bit more detail. First, a word about the language we use in speaking about a premise's truth or falsity. Although we call it the truth condition, it might actually be better to call it by some other name, since there aren't many real-world situations in which you'll be able to say definitively and with full confidence that a given premise is absolutely true or false. Often you'll want to use more nuanced language in order to qualify your judgment in some way. For example, instead of simply asserting that a premise is true, you might want to say merely that you find it plausible, that is, credible or worthy of belief. And to indicate your level of confidence more precisely, you might want to go further and say that you consider it to be somewhat plausible or highly plausible, or to indicate an extremely high level of plausibility, almost certainly true. Alternatively, if you find reasons to object to a given premise, you might want to say you find it implausible rather than simply asserting that it's false. Again, you can use phrases like somewhat implausible or highly implausible or almost certainly false to indicate your level of confidence more precisely. So much for the terminology. But how can you actually decide whether and to what degree you find a given premise to be true or false, plausible or implausible? It's not easy to give general rules for this, but I want to suggest three criteria that will enable you to judge many premises. To make your judgment, you can rely on personal experience, common knowledge, and expert opinion. Suppose you were evaluating an argument that included the premise, all cold medicines cause drowsiness. To decide whether you find this statement plausible, you might start by reflecting on your own personal experience. Have you ever taken a cold medicine yourself? If so, your experience might give you at least some grounds for deciding whether you find the premise plausible or not. If you've taken several cold medicines, and if on each occasion you later felt lethargic and sleepy, you'd have reason to think that this premise is at least somewhat plausible. On the other hand, if you once took a cold medicine and then found yourself lying wide awake in bed for several hours, you'd have reason to find it implausible. Of course, we all know that our own experience is highly limited and sometimes deceptive, so we can't rely too heavily on this criterion. Still, you do have personal experience of many things, and where you have relevant experience, you can always ask if the premise is or seems to be in agreement with it. If the premise is consistent with your own experience, that gives you grounds for judging it to be plausible. If it conflicts with your experience, you have reason to find it implausible. A second criterion you can turn to is our common knowledge of the world we live in. By common knowledge, I mean what most people know, or at least most educated people, without having to turn to a reference source of some kind. It includes the many things we've all learned over the years at home, in school, and elsewhere, even if we can't remember exactly when or from whom, and even if we have no relevant experience of our own. It's common knowledge that plants need soil, water, and light in order to survive. It's common knowledge that palm trees are usually found in tropical or subtropical climates. It's common knowledge that some medicines have side effects. Of course, we know that what we think of as common knowledge isn't always as common as we might believe. It's sometimes imprecise, one-sided, or flawed in other ways. We also know that new discoveries occasionally show that our supposed common knowledge is actually wrong, or at least incomplete. So here again, we can't assume that common knowledge is an infallible guide to the truth of a premise any more than personal experience is. Still, if you find that a premise is supported by common knowledge or in conflict with it, that gives you another basis for judging it to be plausible or implausible. A third criterion is whether or not the premise would be accepted by unbiased experts. Generally speaking, experts are people who have education, experience, and credentials in a specific area of activity or study. On other matters, their opinions carry no more weight than anyone else's. But within their area of expertise, experts have knowledge that goes far beyond what is common. A master mechanic is much more likely than most of us to know all the things that can go wrong with a car's transmission system. A PhD in chemistry is more likely to know how batteries can be disposed of safely. A licensed pharmacist would probably know whether or not all cold medicines cause drowsiness. Of course, no expert knows everything, even in her own field, and there will always be some matters on which the experts disagree. Moreover, we all know that experts are sometimes biased by pride or self-interest. So once again, we should be careful about accepting expert opinion as an infallible guide. Still, if you're considering a premise that falls into a field in which there are recognized experts, and if it makes a claim that most unbiased experts would accept or reject, that gives you a reasonable basis for judging the premise's plausibility. In some cases, you may find that all three of these criteria are relevant and useful. If you're considering a premise stating that young children should not be separated from their parents for long periods of time, you might draw on personal experience and common knowledge, as well as expert opinion, to make your judgment. But there will be other cases for which only one or two of the three criteria would be appropriate. If you have no personal experience of cold medicines, you'll have to rely on common knowledge or expert opinion, or perhaps the two together, in order to decide whether you find a given premise about them plausible or not. There's no simple formula for deciding which of the three criteria you should rely on, or rely on most heavily, when judging the plausibility of a given premise. But you'll need to make some kind of judgment in order to decide whether the argument you're evaluating meets the truth condition, and these three offer you a good place to start. Later on, we'll introduce some additional wrinkles, but you can begin by drawing on personal experience, common knowledge, and expert opinion.